You know, when you spend a decade of your life in the noise, the absolute, grinding, dusty, dangerous noise of combat zones, you start to believe that silence is the greatest prize the world can offer. That's what I chased. I earned that silence, and so did my partner. My name is Cal Jenkins, and for 10 years I was a sergeant major in the Army, specifically handling military working dogs. And my partner, the best dog I ever saw, was a Belgian, Malinois named Ghost. We came home together. Not everyone gets to do that. Usually, when the handler rotates out, the dog stays in theater or gets reassigned. But Ghost and I, we were a package deal. We'd saved each other's lives enough times that the paperwork just seemed to bend to the will of fate. I retired, and a month later, Ghost was officially adopted by me. He was mine, forever. We settled down in a little ranch house in upstate North Carolina. Nothing fancy, just quiet. My wife, Sarah, had spent years waiting for us, and she was thrilled. I was too, mostly. The first few weeks were adjustment hell, though. For me, the silence was deafening. Every time a car backfired 3 blocks away, I'd flinch and drop into a crouch. Sarah would just pat my arm and tell me, "It's just the neighborhood, Cal. You're safe." Ghost was supposed to be the stable one. He was the machine. In the field, he was perfect. He could sift through the smell of diesel, sweat, and burning trash and still flag the tiniest trace of C4 buried under 2 feet of concrete. He was focused. He was relentless. He was my shadow, my early warning system, my best friend, and frankly, the reason I still had all my limbs. But at home, he was different. He wasn't destructive. He wasn't aggressive. He was just heavy. He walked around the house like he was carrying a 50-pound pack, his tail low. He kept his ears up all the time, listening to the house settle, listening to the ice maker clink, listening to the squirrels on the roof. Everything was a potential threat, just like the sand dunes outside Kandahar. I figured that would fade. It was trauma, right? We both had it. We'd unpack it slowly, together, in the quiet sunshine of North Carolina. But then the staring started. It began about 3 weeks after we moved in. It was a Tuesday night. We'd had dinner, Sarah was watching some terrible reality TV show she loved, and I was trying, unsuccessfully, to read a book that wasn't a technical manual on explosives. Ghost was lying by my feet, chewing on a heavy-duty rubber toy, the sound of his teeth grinding against the plastic the only consistent rhythm in the room. It was around 9:30 p.m. He stopped chewing, just froze. I looked down. His head wasn't tilted, which is what they do when they hear a strange noise. His ears were up, but his body was rigid. It was the posture of a dog that has just locked onto a scent or a movement that means certain danger. It was the, "I found it, boss. What's the next move?" stance. I followed his gaze. He wasn't looking at the TV, or Sarah, or the window. He was looking down the main hallway. Now, this hallway wasn't anything special. It was maybe 15 feet long. It connected the living room to the 2 bedrooms and the linen closet. It was painted a light beige. Sarah called it desert sand, which I found darkly hilarious. And at the far end, past the guest room door, the light was always a little dimmer. "What is it, buddy?" I whispered, nudging him gently with my foot. Ghost didn't move. His breathing went shallow. I got up. I figured maybe a mouse had gotten in, or a draft was moving. A curtain just right. That's what you do when you're home. You find mundane explanations for things that used to be life or death scenarios. I walked the length of the hallway, slowly, letting my eyes adjust to the shadows. I checked the doors. Closed. I checked the floorboards. Nothing. I opened the linen closet. Just towels and cleaning supplies. I even knelt down and looked under the runner rug. Empty. "Clear," I told Ghost when I got back to the couch. He blinked slowly, like a man waking up from a dream, and then he went back to his rubber toy. He didn't seem satisfied exactly, but he broke the concentration. "Did you see that?" I asked Sarah. She paused the TV, looking annoyed. "See what? The dog being weird. He's a rescue, Cal. He's probably dreaming about chasing rabbits." He wasn't dreaming. That was a high-alert posture. He saw something, or heard something I didn't. "Well, if it was a mouse, I hope he catches it," she said, and unpaused her show. I let it go. One weird incident. Maybe the dog was finally losing it in his old age. He was 7, which is getting up there for a high-octane military dog. But the next night, it happened again. Same time. 9:30 p.m. We were in the kitchen this time, doing dishes. Ghost was sprawled out near the back door. The minute the clock hit that magic half-hour mark, he snapped his head up and fixed his gaze down the hallway again. He wasn't looking at the kitchen door, which was closer. He was looking through the dining room and into that central beige hallway. This time, I didn't try to rationalize it. I went straight to him. "Ghost, show me." I used the low, serious tone I used overseas when I needed him to track a dangerous scent. It was a command he never failed to obey. He stood up slowly, his muscles coiled. He didn't bark. He never barked unless it was necessary. He just started walking, low to the ground, sniffing. He went past the dining room table, paused by the coat closet, and then moved into the hallway itself. He tracked the air, moving his nose from side to side, exactly like he was clearing a path in a suspected IED zone. He tracked all the way to the end, right where the light from the living room faded into the shadow of the linen closet. And then he stopped. He didn't scratch the floor. He didn't whine. He just stood there, staring intensely at the wall, the blank drywall partition that separated the hallway from the outside wall of the guest bedroom. I got down on my knees next to him. "What is it, boy? Smell anything?" I sniffed the air myself, feeling ridiculous. I smelled dust, fresh laundry detergent from the closet, and the faint scent of Sarah's cinnamon candle. Nothing else. I checked the wall. It was solid. No vents, no cracks, no mouse holes I could see. Ghost stayed locked on. His ears were rotated slightly backward, a sign of deep concentration and slight nervousness. I grabbed his collar gently. "Let's go, buddy. There's nothing here." I pulled him back toward the living room and he resisted. Not aggressively, but with the full weight of his 85 pounds. He wanted to stay there. He was convinced whatever he was looking for, or at, was right there. It took me a minute to coax him back to the couch, and even then he kept glancing back down the hall, his eyes narrowed. This time, Sarah noticed. "Cal, he's freaking me out. Is he sick? Did he eat something outside?" "No, he's fine. Physically, I think he's just confused," I admitted. But I knew Ghost wasn't confused. Ghost was the most mentally sharp animal I'd ever encountered. Confusion wasn't in his programming. He was reacting to a stimulus that was invisible to me. Over the next few weeks, this hallway ritual became our new normal. Every night between 9:20 and 9:40 p.m., Ghost would get up, walk to the end of the hallway, and stare at the blank wall next to the linen closet. It didn't matter if we were outside on the porch or in the garage. When that time hit, he would seek out that spot. If I tried to distract him with a walk or a game of fetch, he'd participate half-heartedly, but the second we came back inside, he'd go straight to the hallway. I started taking pictures of the wall. I sent them to my old sergeant, Mac, who was still in Germany running the K9 program. Me. "Hey, Mac, this is going to sound nuts, but Ghost is obsessed with this spot. Every night, no smell, no sound I can detect." Mac wrote back immediately. "Is he digging? Scratching?" Me. "No, just staring. Intense focus, like he's waiting for a door to open." Mac. "Check for hidden wiring, man, or maybe a gas leak. Malinois noses are ridiculous. If it's nothing, take him to a civilian vet and have his sinuses checked. Could be an infection making him smell things." I followed Mac's advice. I checked the wiring. Clean. I called the gas company. They came out, checked the lines, and found nothing. I took Ghost to Dr. Miller, a great local vet. "Doctor, Miller ran a full panel of tests: X-rays, blood work, nasal swabs. "Cal, this dog is in magnificent health for a 7-year-old MWD," Dr. Miller told me, scratching Ghost behind his heavy-duty harness. "His senses are sharp. No infection, no signs of cognitive decline. He's just a little stressed from the change of environment, which is normal for a dog with his history." "But the staring, Doc? It's not normal stress. It's precise. It's the same time, the same spot." Dr. Miller laughed gently. "Dogs are creatures of habit. Maybe he sees a shadow at that time of night, or the way the streetlights hit the house. I wouldn't worry about it unless he starts hurting himself or the house." But I was worried, because I knew Ghost. You have to understand what it meant to work with Ghost in the field. He wasn't a pet. He was a piece of specialized military equipment that happened to have a soul. I met him 5 years ago, right before my 3rd tour. He was fresh out of training, all muscle and intensity. Our first mission together was a mess. We were clearing a compound in a remote area, and the intelligence was shaky. We were moving down a corridor, a long, concrete hallway much like this one, except it smelled like burning oil and fear. We were pinned down, heavy fire from the far end. My team was taking cover, waiting for the breach. I sent Ghost ahead, the leash loose, trusting his nose. He ran maybe 20 feet, and then he froze. Not in the hallway, but right next to it, staring at a small access panel set low in the wall. He gave me the sit signal, the sign for explosives. My commander yelled, "Jenkins, move. What's he doing?" "He's got something," I yelled back. I had to trust him. There was no time to wait for the EOD team. I pulled the team back around the corner, and we laid down cover fire while I got a closer look. The access panel was rigged. Not with a standard pressure plate, but with a tripwire so fine you couldn't see it unless you were 2 inches away. If we had tried to breach the hallway, that whole section would have blown, taking out half the team. Ghost saved our lives by detecting the faint smell of the explosive residue through the sheet metal of that panel. That's the kind of dog he was. He didn't waste energy. He didn't chase ghosts. He reacted to reality, however subtle. And now, here we were in North Carolina, with a mortgage and a lawn to mow, and Ghost was reacting with that same life-or-death intensity to a beige drywall partition. I started thinking about the house itself. It was built in the early 90s, perfectly standard suburban construction. Sarah and I hadn't noticed anything strange when we bought it. No weird history, no police reports, nothing. One Saturday morning, I decided I had to figure it out myself. I got out the blueprints the realtor had left us. I spread them out on the dining room table, tracing the lines with my finger until I found the hallway. I checked the wall where Ghost stared. It was the exterior wall of the guest bedroom. Nothing special, no chimney stack, no plumbing run, nothing structural that would create a unique vibration or sound, wave. But then I looked closer at the foundation outline. There was a discrepancy. The original plans showed a small, unused utility space underneath that specific corner of the guest bedroom. A low crawl space about 4 feet by 6 feet, accessible only from the outside, meant for the old septic cleanout that had since been rerouted. It wasn't technically part of the main crawl space under the house. It was sealed off. I remembered seeing a small, square metal plate set into the concrete foundation outside, right under the guest room window. I thought it was just a relic. That night, I waited. 9:25 p.m. Ghost was already up, pacing the perimeter of the living room, heading for the hallway. When he reached his spot, he stood there, head low, staring. I didn't try to stop him this time. I watched him. I watched his nostrils flare. He was definitely smelling something. It wasn't aggressive, though. It was investigation, almost curiosity mixed with apprehension. I went and got my tools, a heavy-duty flashlight, a hammer, and a small crowbar. "I'm going to check the crawl space outside," I told Sarah. "I think there might be an animal den down there." "Be careful, Cal. don't mess up the foundation. I went out the back door. It was a cool night, the kind of still, clear night where you can hear every cricket and every distant siren. I walked around the side of the house until I got to the guest bedroom window. There it was, the square metal plate, flush with the concrete foundation. It was bolted down with 4 large, rusted screws. I got to work. The screws were old and seized up. It took me a good 20 minutes, scraping my knuckles and swearing under my breath before I managed to pry the plate off. The minute the plate came off, a wave of cool, damp, earthy air rushed out. It smelled like old dirt, pine needles, and something faintly metallic. I shined the flashlight in. It was exactly as the blueprints showed. A small, dark void, maybe 4 feet deep and 6 feet wide. The dirt floor was undisturbed except for a few cobwebs. I pulled myself through the small opening. It was cramped and dusty. I swept the beam of the flashlight around the space. Nothing. No animal bones, no nests, no signs of intrusion. Just concrete walls and dry dirt. Wait. I moved the beam to the far corner, directly under the spot where Ghost stared inside. There was a small, man-made depression in the dirt floor. It wasn't a hole exactly. It was more like a shallow circular impression, maybe 1.5 feet across. And right next to the impression, tucked against the concrete, was a single object. It was a small plastic water bottle. The cheap, disposable kind. But it wasn't empty. It was filled with dirt and sealed with duct tape. I picked it up. It was heavy. It felt like something someone had intentionally buried, or maybe hidden, and then forgotten. The moment I touched it, I heard a terrible sound from inside the house. It wasn't a bark. It was a deep, guttural cry of distress. Ghost. I scrambled out of the crawl space, dropping the bottle onto the concrete. I didn't even stop to replace the cover plate. I burst back into the house, covered in dust and cobwebs. Sarah was standing in the living room, her face white. Ghost was still in the hallway, but he wasn't staring at the wall anymore. He was looking directly at the floor, right where I had been standing on the other side of the wall. And he was shaking. Violently. "Cal, what did you do?" Sarah whispered. He started crying. I've never heard him make that sound. I rushed over to Ghost. He was whimpering, pressing himself against the wall, his head bowed. He was clearly terrified, but also desperate. I knelt down and checked him over. "I didn't do anything, buddy. I just opened the crawl space." I stood up, holding my flashlight. "Did you bring anything in?" Sarah asked, pointing toward the front door. I realized I had left the plastic bottle outside. No, I left it outside, but I found something. I stopped talking, because I finally noticed what was different about the hallway. The silence. It was the deepest, most profound silence I had ever experienced in that house. The silence I had chased for a decade. But this wasn't peaceful. It was oppressive. It was the silence you get right before a mortar shell lands. And Ghost was still focused entirely on the ground. I looked down at the beige carpet runner. Nothing. But Ghost wasn't looking at the carpet. He was looking through it. He nudged his nose hard against the floorboards right at the base of the wall and let out a single, sharp yelp, the sound he used when he was confirming a successful detection. He had found it, whatever it was. I went back outside, heart pounding, retrieved the bottle and brought it back into the hallway. The minute I crossed the threshold, Ghost stopped shaking. He stood up, alert, and focused his attention entirely on the plastic bottle in my hand. He didn't try to grab it. He just sniffed it deeply, and then he let out a sigh, a real, audible release of tension. "Okay," I said, holding the bottle up. "You found this? This is what you were staring at?" Ghost sat, confirming the discovery. Sarah came closer, cautiously. "What is that, Cal? Looks like a time capsule." I took my pocket knife and carefully peeled back the duct tape. The plastic cap came off. Easily. Inside, it was packed tight with dry dirt, but nestled right on top, wrapped in a thin layer of plastic wrap, was a small object. I carefully lifted it out. It was a key, an old brass skeleton key, heavy and tarnished. It looked like something that would open a very old, very heavy box, or maybe a massive antique door. A key? Sarah sounded disappointed. That's what's been giving Ghost nightmares. An old key? I held the key in my palm, feeling the weight of the brass. No, I said slowly, looking at Ghost, who was now wagging his tail, the tension completely gone. I don't think he was staring at the key. I think he was staring at the container. He had been smelling the plastic bottle, hidden just feet away on the other side of the wall, every night at the same time. The air currents must have carried the faint plastic scent through the foundation gap right at 9:30 p.m., when the air pressure shifted. It was a classic MWD scenario, a scent trapped in a void, waiting to be identified. I felt a huge rush of relief. The mystery was solved. Ghost wasn't seeing ghosts. He was just doing his job professionally and relentlessly, even in retirement. Well, now that that's settled, Sarah said, picking up the bottle to throw it away, we can finally have a normal evening. Hold on, I said, taking the key back. This key is still important. Why would someone bury it outside the foundation? And why in a sealed bottle? The key felt significant. It felt old. It felt like it belonged to a history that wasn't ours. I spent the next day doing some casual research online about our house and the surrounding neighborhood. It was a small, planned community built on what used to be farmland. Nothing exciting. But the key kept nagging at me. It was too specific to be random trash. I took it to a local locksmith, a grizzled old guy named Frank who ran a shop downtown. Frank looked at the key, turning it over in his hand. Well, this isn't modern, son. This is pre-1940s, maybe even earlier. Brass alloy. It's a lockbox key, or maybe a safety deposit box key. Too intricate for a regular house lock. Can you trace it? Not really, unless it has a specific bank stamp, which it doesn't. You found this, I told him the story. The dog, the hallway, the buried bottle. I left out the military part. People get weird about that. Frank just whistled. That dog of yours is better than a metal detector. Look, if it's a safe deposit key, it might have a number on the back. I flipped the key over. Etched into the brass faintly were 3 digits. 5-0-2. There you go, Frank said. Now you know the box number, but you don't know the bank. That was the end of the line, I figured. It was a cool story, a testament to Ghost's incredible nose, and now we had a nice piece of brass junk. I tossed the key into the small wooden bowl we kept on the kitchen counter for loose change and keys, and I forgot about it. For about a week. Ghost was back to normal. He slept peacefully. He chased squirrels. He didn't look at the hallway once after 9 p.m. The silence was finally the good kind of silence. But the silence only lasted until the next Tuesday night. It was 9:35 p.m. Sarah and I were asleep. I woke up because Ghost was standing on top of me, his heavy paws pressing into my chest. He was whining, a low, urgent sound right next to my ear. I sat up instantly, adrenaline spiking. I had woken up like this 1,000 times overseas. Something was wrong. Ghost, what is it? He jumped off the bed and raced to the bedroom door. He looked back at me, then nudged. The door opened with his nose and took off. I threw on a pair of shorts and followed him. He wasn't in the living room. He wasn't at the back door. He was in the hallway. And he was staring again. But this wasn't the same. Before, it was focused investigation. Now, it was frantic. He wasn't staring at the wall where the bottle had been. He was staring at the door of the guest bedroom, which was 3 feet closer to the living room. And the door was slightly ajar. We always kept that door closed. "Did you open that door, Sarah?" I called back to the bedroom. "No, I thought you did," she called back, her voice tight with panic. I moved slowly, professionally. I checked the lock. It was a cheap interior latch, easily jiggled open by a stiff breeze or an old dog, but the room was dead silent. Ghost was whining, but he wasn't trying to go in. He was holding the threshold, his body tense. I pushed the door open the rest of the way. The room was dark. I reached for the light switch. The light flickered on. The room was empty. Twin bed, dresser, a stack of boxes we hadn't unpacked yet. But the air was cold, noticeably colder than the rest of the house. I looked down at Ghost. He was fixated on the window. The window was closed, the blinds drawn. I walked over and pulled the blinds open. The streetlights cast long, yellow shadows across the lawn. Nothing out there. I turned back to the room, ready to dismiss it as a draft or a nervous dog, when I saw it. On the small bedside table where Sarah had placed a ceramic lamp and a coaster, something had been moved. The coaster was a cork square. It was sitting on top of a loose piece of paper. The paper hadn't been there when we bought the house. It was folded neatly in half. I picked it up. It was old, yellowed, and felt brittle, like it had been hidden somewhere damp for a long time. I unfolded it. It was a map. A crude, hand-drawn sketch of the property, showing the house, the backyard fence line, and an old oak tree that stood near the property line. And drawn next to the oak tree, marked with a heavy, faded X, were the numbers 502. The key. The numbers matched the key. And this couldn't be a coincidence. Someone had been in the house, and they had left a message. I looked at Ghost. He was staring at the paper in my hand, his tail just barely twitching. "Cal, who was in here?" Sarah was standing in the doorway now, shivering. "I don't know," I said, my military training kicking in, overriding the domestic calm. "But they didn't take anything. They just left this." I looked back at the map. The X was specific. It was about 40 feet past the back porch, right where the old oak tree met the fence. I grabbed my jeans and a shirt. "Stay here, Sarah. Lock the door behind me. I'm going outside." I knew what I had to do. I had to follow the map. I went straight to the kitchen bowl, grabbed the heavy brass key, and clipped Ghost's leash onto his harness. "Let's go, buddy," I whispered. "Oh, time to work." Ghost was instantly alert. He stopped trembling. The transition from scared pet to working MWD was instantaneous. He trotted alongside me as I headed for the back door, the leash held tight in my hand. We stepped out onto the lawn. The air was colder now. I used my phone flashlight to navigate the yard. Ghost walked with purpose, pulling slightly toward the location marked on the map. We reached the oak tree. It was massive, its roots snaking across the ground like thick, dark pythons. I found the spot marked by the X. It was right at the base of the largest root, almost hidden by the long grass. The ground here was soft. Too soft. Someone had definitely been digging recently. I knelt down and scraped away the topsoil with my hands. A few inches down, my fingers hit something hard. It was wood. I pulled away more dirt until I uncovered the object. It was a heavy, square wooden box, maybe 18 inches wide. It was clearly old, the wood darkened and stained, and bound with heavy iron straps. And right in the center of the lid, there was a tarnished brass lock. I took the key out of my pocket. It fit perfectly. I turned the key. The lock clicked, loudly, in the dead silence of the night. Ghost stood guard, still and silent, watching the perimeter. I threw the lid open. I shone the flashlight inside. The box was lined with old, faded velvet, but it wasn't full of money or jewelry or gold. It was full of papers, thick stacks of brittle yellowed documents tied neatly with brown ribbon. I pulled the top stack out. The paper felt like tissue in my hands. I carefully unfolded the top sheet. It was a letter dated 1957. The handwriting was neat, slanted cursive. I held it up to the faint light of my phone and read the first line. My dearest Amelia, I'm writing this because I know I don't have much time left, and you need to know the truth about what happened on the 3rd floor of the barracks. What they did to him, and what they made us promise never to tell. I froze. The 3rd floor of the barracks. I looked down at Ghost. I looked back at the hallway that led to the guest bedroom, the hallway that sat directly over the sealed crawlspace. I realized then that the key wasn't the end of the mystery. It was just the lock. And Ghost hadn't been smelling plastic and dirt. He had been smelling history. And if that letter was true, it wasn't just history we had found. It was a secret, a military secret, buried right under my quiet suburban home, and someone had broken in to make sure I found it. The silence of the night suddenly felt heavy with accusation. I had to know what was in those papers. I had to know why Ghost had been staring at the guest room door tonight. I scooped up the entire box, closed the lid, and hurried back toward the house, Ghost trotting protectively at my side. I locked the back door and brought the box into the kitchen. Sarah was waiting, wide-eyed. What is it, Cal? What did you find? I placed the box on the counter. I found a story, Sarah, and I think it's a story that involves soldiers, secrets, and maybe the real reason Ghost was staring at that hallway every single night. I looked at the guest bedroom door, which now felt less like a spare room and more like the entrance to a crime scene. We need to read these, I said, every single word. I untied the ribbon on the first stack of papers. The top one was that letter. The next one was a faded, official-looking document, stamped with the seal of the U.S. Army. The title across the top of the official document, written in heavy black typewriter font, read, Project Nightwatch, Field Report, Barracks 3, Section C. And then I saw the date, October 1956, the same date the letter writer mentioned. I leaned against the counter, suddenly exhausted. We weren't just dealing with the dog's anxiety anymore. We were dealing with something that the military had tried to bury 60 years ago, and Ghost's nose had dug it right back up. I started reading the official report first, trying to find out what Project Nightwatch was and why it was connected to this quiet house in North Carolina. The report was heavily redacted, but the surviving text was chilling. It detailed an experimental program involving psychological conditioning and sensory deprivation, conducted on a small group of personnel at a remote military base. The goal was to create perfect sentries who could detect threats where human eyes and ears failed. The report mentioned 3 subjects. 2 code names were blacked out. The 3rd was visible. PFC Thomas A. Vance. I flipped to the next page, which was another letter, this one less formal, written by a different hand, dated a week after the official report. Amelia. They moved Tom back to the old compound, the one near the air base. He doesn't talk anymore. He just stares at the walls. They say he's done, that the conditioning worked too well. He's seeing things that aren't there, or maybe he's seeing things that are there, just not yet. They put him in Barracks 3, Section C, the isolation wing. I'm scared, Amelia. I think they broke him. They say he keeps staring at the end of the hallway waiting for his shift change, but the shift never comes. I looked up from the letter. My blood ran cold. The end of the hallway. Barracks 3, Section C, isolation. I walked back to the hallway, the brass key heavy in my hand. I stared at the spot where Ghost and I walked back to the hallway, the brass key heavy in my hand. I stared at the spot where Ghost had been fixated for weeks, the blank wall next to the linen closet. The difference now was that I knew what was under it, a small, sealed crawlspace, and I knew what was behind it, the ghost of a military experiment gone wrong. I looked at Sarah, who was still pale, standing by the kitchen counter. "We need coffee," I said, my voice sounding flat and professional, the way it used to sound when I was briefing the team, before a high-risk entry. And we need to stay awake. We spent the next 4 hours huddled over that wooden box on the kitchen table. The documents were a jigsaw puzzle made of fear and faded ink. Project Nightwatch, as far as we could piece together from the heavily censored reports and the frantic letters, was exactly what I had suspected. The military trying to perfect the perfect soldier, the ultimate human sentinel. They weren't training people to run faster or shoot straighter. They were training them to feel the battlefield. PFC Thomas A. Vance was their star pupil. The reports described him as having unprecedented sensory acuity. They isolated him in Barracks 3, Section C, the isolation wing. They used techniques I couldn't even imagine: sustained sensory deprivation, followed by sudden, intense stimuli. They broke down his natural filters until every change in air, pressure, every subtle hum of electricity, every molecule of scent registered as an immediate, life-threatening threat. The idea was that Vance could stand watch and detect an enemy approach, a hidden mine, or a chemical agent long before any machine, or even a trained dog, could. He was supposed to be the ultimate early warning system. He was, for a short time. The official report, dated October 1956, summarized the success clinically. Subject Vance achieved sustained state of hypervigilance, successfully identifying 98% of simulated environmental threats during testing phase. Subject is now considered fully conditioned. But the letters told the real story. The second letter, written by a friend only identified as J, was heartbreaking. They pushed him too far, Amelia. He can't turn it off. He hears the pipes moving in the walls. He smells the dust settling. He feels the earth turning beneath the foundation. They told him that if he ever relaxed, if he ever stopped watching the hallway, he would die. And now he believes it. He just stands there, watching the end of the hall, waiting for the threat they promised would come. He hasn't slept in 3 days. The doctors say he's catatonic, but I think he's just terrified. I closed the letter. The paper was thin and fragile. He was broken, Sarah whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. They turned him into a machine, and then they just left him to rust. They turned him into Ghost, I said, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. That was the connection. Ghost wasn't just anxious from combat. He was a Malinois, trained for hypervigilance. He was designed to be the perfect sentry, just like Vance. They both carried the same burden, the absolute conviction that if they missed one single, subtle threat, people would die. And now, Ghost was living in the exact geographical location where another hypervigilant sentry had mentally collapsed from the strain. I grabbed my laptop and started cross-referencing the location data in the military documents with current property records. It took me less than an hour to confirm my fear. Our quiet suburban ranch house, built in 1991, sat on land that had been part of the old Fort Bragg Annex. The specific plot our foundation occupied was, beyond a shadow of a doubt, the site of Barracks 3, Section C, the isolation wing. Our hallway, I said, pointing toward the beige corridor, is PFC Vance's hallway. He died here, Sarah, mentally, if not physically. The letters confirmed Vance was transferred out shortly after the breakdown, listed as medically retired. But the letters strongly implied the military covered up the extent of his injuries and confined him, possibly to avoid admitting they had successfully driven a man insane by turning him into a living sensor. "But why now?" Sarah asked, gripping my arm. "Why did someone break in and leave that map?" We still had the rest of the papers in the box. I started carefully examining the remaining documents. Most were dry, administrative reports, but the last stack contained a series of hand-drawn diagrams, much like the map we found on the nightstand. These weren't property maps. They were architectural sketches of the old barracks showing ventilation shafts, electrical conduits, and, most importantly, the floor plan of Barracks 3, Section C. I found the sketch of the isolation wing. It was a single, long corridor with 3 small cells. The final cell, marked with a tiny, frantic circle, was the room directly corresponding to our guest bedroom. And right outside that cell, in the hallway, the sketch showed a small, almost invisible detail. A tiny, etched circle on the floor labeled Vance's watch point. I got up, the blood draining from my face. I walked straight to the hallway. I knelt down on the carpet runner, right where Ghost had nudged the floor earlier that night. I pushed the rug aside and examined the hardwood floor beneath. Nothing, just old oak planks. But I got my flashlight and held the beam low, parallel to the floorboards. In the harsh light, I saw it. Faintly etched into the wood, right at the baseboard of the guest room wall, was a tiny, almost imperceptible scratch mark. It was circular, exactly where the sketch indicated Vance's watch point was. He had stood here, for days, staring. I looked down the hallway toward the linen closet and the spot where the light always faded. That was the end of his visibility. That was the point he was told to watch. And Ghost had been staring at the exact same point, night after night, for 3 weeks. He wasn't smelling the plastic, I whispered. He was smelling the fear. Ghost, who had been lying quietly by the kitchen, lifted his head. He watched me in the hallway, his ears alert. "The key," Sarah said, picking up the brass key from the counter. "It has the number 502. That's the lockbox number. But what did it unlock?" We went back to the box. We had found the letters, the reports, and the floor plans. Was there anything else? I sifted through the dusty, brittle paper. Near the bottom, tucked underneath the velvet lining, I found a small, leather-bound notebook. It was Vance's journal. It wasn't a military log. It was a diary of his descent. It was written in a tight, looping script that started out neat and slowly devolved into hurried, chaotic scrawls. Opened it to the beginning. October 3rd, 1956. The isolation is intense. No sound, no light. They say this is the only way to cleanse the senses. I feel like my ears are trying to listen to the blood moving in my veins. The sergeant told me the next phase is critical. They are going to introduce the threat stimulus. I must detect it, or they will fail the project. I must not fail. I skipped ahead a few entries, reading the terrifying progression. October 10th. The hallway is where it happens. They make me stand watch for 12 hours. I have to find the anomaly. I hear the floorboards creak, but it is not a man. It's too faint. I smell ozone before a storm, but there is no storm. I see the light shift, but there is no door opening. They are testing me. They are trying to find the point where I break. October 15th. I detected it, the threat. It wasn't a smell or a sound. It was a feeling. A cold spot. Right at the end of the hall, near the utility access. It felt like something was being drawn out of the air. I flagged it. I gave the signal. They were ecstatic, but they didn't tell me what it was. They just told me to keep watching it. It's still there. It never leaves. October 18th. The cold spot is getting stronger. I see shadows moving in the dim light. They aren't human. They are jagged, like static. Electricity given shape. I keep telling the sergeant I found the threat, but he just smiles and says, "Keep watching, Vance. It gets worse if you look away." I haven't looked away. I can't. I am the sentry. The journal ended abruptly on October 20th, 1956. The last entry was just a single, giant word scrawled across the page, repeated until the ink ran dry. Waiting. 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 I closed the journal, my hands shaking. The military hadn't just broken Vance. They had terrified him into seeing something that wasn't there, or something that was there. but was too subtle for normal perception. They had created a psychic wound in this house, and Ghost was detecting the residual trauma, the echo of Vance's constant, desperate watch. This explained the staring, it explained the location, but it didn't explain the break-in, the map, or the key. Someone wanted us to find this. "We need to. Call the police," Sarah insisted. "Someone was in the house, Cal. We need to report the break-in." "And tell them what?" I countered. "That my former military dog, who is detecting the ghost of a psychologically tortured soldier, led me to a buried box full of redacted documents? They'll send me for a 72-hour evaluation." I knew better. If this was a military cover-up from 60 years ago, involving a secret project, the last thing I needed was local law enforcement involved. "The key," I said, picking it up again. "Why bury it? Why the 502? And why leave a map to the key right here, after the fact?" I looked at the map again. The X was at the oak tree. The key was buried there. "What if the key isn't for a lockbox?" Sarah suggested, looking at the number 502. "What if it's a date? May 2nd? "Maybe," I conceded, but Frank the locksmith was pretty sure it was a box number. I walked back into the living room, Ghost following me closely. He was calm now, the tension from the night before gone. He seemed satisfied that the box was recovered. "We need to know who wrote these letters," I said, running my hand over the dark, heavy wood of the box. "And why they risked burying this here." The most detailed letter was signed only with an initial. A. "Amelia," Sarah said, remembering the journal. "My dearest Amelia." The woman who wrote the first letter, Amelia, must have been a confidant of Vance's friend, Jay. And she must have lived nearby, or somehow came into possession of these documents and the key, perhaps entrusted with them before Jay or Vance disappeared entirely. I spent the rest of the day on the phone, digging through local historical societies and property records, trying to find anyone named Vance, or Jay, or Amelia, connected to the area in 1957. It was a dead end. The records were sparse, and the military base's history was tightly restricted. That night, I put Ghost on a tight schedule. I didn't want him back in the hallway at 9:30 p.m., waiting for the echo of Vance's trauma to hit. I took him for a long, grueling run, wore him out, and fed him a huge dinner. By 9 p.m., he was asleep on the rug, snoring lightly. Peace. Sarah and I were in the living room, trying to watch a movie, but all I could hear was the silence of the house. I kept expecting the floorboards to creak or the temperature to drop. 9:30 p.m. came and went. Ghost didn't stir. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. We had broken the cycle. By recovering the container, we had neutralized the initial scent trigger. By understanding the history, I felt like I had shielded Ghost from the psychological residue. "See?" Sarah smiled weakly. "It's over. We found the secret. We solved the mystery. Now we burn the box and move on." I nodded, but I felt a prickle of unease. The break-in hadn't felt like a random act. It felt deliberate, like the last step in a long, complicated process. At 11:00 p.m., Sarah went to bed. I stayed up, trying to read Vance's journal again, hoping for a clue about the physical threat he claimed to have detected. The cold spot that felt like something being drawn out of the air. Around 11:45 p.m., I heard a noise. It wasn't a loud noise. It was a scraping sound. Very faint. It was coming from the hallway. I froze, listening. Ghost was still asleep. Scrape. Scrape. It sounded like fingernails on wood, or maybe a small stone being dragged across the floor. I reached for the heavy flashlight I kept next to the couch. I stood up slowly. Ghost was instantly awake, but he didn't jump up. He lifted his massive head, his eyes wide and fixed on the hallway entrance. He wasn't whining in fear. He was giving me the listen posture. Ears rotated forward, body low, absolutely motionless. I took one step toward the hallway. Scrape. Scrape. It was definitely in the hallway near the guest room. I walked toward the sound, my adrenaline kicking in. This wasn't the 9:30 p.m. ghost watch. This was something new. This was physical. When I reached the threshold, I paused. The hallway was dark, illuminated only by the faint spill of light from the living room. I shined the flashlight beam down the corridor. The sound stopped. The hallway was empty. Clear, I muttered, moving forward slowly. I checked the linen closet. Closed. I checked the floorboards. Nothing on the runner rug. I reached the guest bedroom door. It was closed tight this time. I knelt down, pressing my ear against the wood, listening for the sound again. Nothing. I stood up and turned around, ready to tell Ghost it was just the house settling, when I saw him. Ghost was standing at the entrance to the hallway, not looking at me but looking past me, into the guest bedroom. His body was trembling slightly, the way it had when I opened the crawl space. And then I heard a sound that made the hairs stand up on the back of my neck. It wasn't a scrape, it was a click. The distinct metallic click of a latch engaging. I spun around and stared at the guest bedroom door. The light was off, but I could see the handle. It had just moved. The door was now locked from the inside. "Sarah!" I yelled, knowing she was asleep in the master bedroom across the hall. Ghost let out a low growl, a sound he reserved for imminent danger. I grabbed the handle and twisted. Locked solid. I hammered on the wood. "Hello? Who's in there? Open up." Silence. Absolute. Terrifying silence from inside the room. Ghost was now pacing frantically in front of the door, his nose pressed against the crack at the bottom. He wasn't smelling plastic or dirt. He was smelling something alive. Something that shouldn't be there. I backed up 2 steps, ready to kick the door in. But before I could, I heard a whisper from inside the room. It was faint, dry, and seemed to come from right next to the wood. It wasn't Sarah. It wasn't a burglar. It was a man's voice, and it said one word, perfectly clear. "Watch." I froze. That was Vance's command. The command they drilled into him until he broke. Ghost reacted violently. He lunged at the door, scratching desperately at the wood, letting out a series of high-pitched, distressed yelps. "Ghost, stop," I commanded, grabbing his harness. I tried the handle again, still locked. I pulled out my phone and called 911. "I have an intruder in my house," I hissed into the phone, keeping my voice low so Sarah wouldn't wake up fully. "He's locked himself in the guest bedroom. I need police immediately." I gave the address. While I was on the line, the metallic clicking sound started again. It was the sound of the latch being manipulated. Click, click, click. The lock was being turned again, and then, with a soft thud, the door unlocked itself. I dropped the phone. The 911 operator was asking me to repeat the address. I pushed the door open, throwing my weight against it. The light fixture in the room was flickering wildly, casting the room in strobing flashes of darkness and light. The room was empty. The bed was undisturbed. The dresser was closed. The stack of boxes was still neatly piled in the corner, and the air was frigid. The same cold spot Vance had described in his journal. I walked into the center of the room, my flashlight beam sweeping the walls. "Clear!" I yelled to the operator who was still on the line. "False alarm. I think I just had a power surge." I hung up before she could respond. I couldn't explain this. Ghost followed me into the room, moving slowly, cautiously. He went straight to the window, sniffing the glass. Then he moved to the bedside table. The paper map was gone. I'd put it in the wooden box with the rest of the documents. But on the coaster, there was a new object. It was a coin, an old, tarnished silver dime. It looked like it had been handled by 1,000 desperate hands. I picked it up. It was cold, unnaturally cold, even in my warm palm. "Cal, what is happening?" Sarah was standing in the doorway, clutching a robe, her face terrified. "I don't know," I admitted, looking at the coin, "but someone was definitely here, or something." I realized that if someone had been in the room, they had to have entered and exited through the locked door without a trace, unless they were still hiding. I checked the closet. Empty. I checked under the bed. Empty. I went to the window. It was latched tight, no sign of tampering. "How did they get in?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know, Sarah, but they left this." I showed her the dime. She didn't even look at the coin. She was staring at the wall behind the bed, the wall that was directly above the sealed crawl space. "Cal," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "the wall." I turned the flashlight beam onto the beige drywall, and there it was. Scratched into the surface as if done with the very coin I held was a single, frantic word. It was the same handwriting as the last entry in Vance's journal. Hiding. I stared at the word. Hiding. Who was hiding? Vance? Or the intruder? Ghost, who had been focused on the room, suddenly snapped his head toward the hallway again. His attention wasn't on the door this time. It was focused on the far end of the hallway, right where the light faded, the spot where Vance had been forced to watch. He started backing up slowly out of the guest room, pulling me with him. "We need to get out of the hall, Cal," Sarah pleaded. I backed up with Ghost until we were standing in the safety of the living room, staring down the corridor. Ghost stood rigid, his tail completely still. He was watching the shadows at the end of the hall. And then I saw it too. It wasn't a shadow of a person. It was a disturbance. A flickering of the air, like heat rising off asphalt on a summer day, except this was cold. It was focused right where the etched circle was on the floor, Vance's watch point. The air shimmered, and then I heard the sound again. Not the scrape, but the sound Vance described in his journal, the faint, almost silent hum. It sounded like the deepest frequency of a generator running far away, a vibration that you felt more than heard. It was the sound of the threat stimulus. Ghost let out a low, desperate whine. He wasn't just reacting to trauma anymore. He was reacting to a persistent, physical anomaly. "That's the cold spot," I breathed. "That's what broke him." I felt a sudden, icy fear grip me. If Vance was broken by this, what was it doing to Ghost, who was equally sensitive? I looked down at the coin in my hand. It was a 1943 silver dime. I suddenly remembered something from one of the letters in the box. Amelia's letter mentioned that before Vance's breakdown, he had been obsessed with carrying a small, lucky coin. He would rub it constantly during the intense sensory tests. This was his coin, and someone, or something, had left it for us. I looked back at the hallway. The shimmering was gone, but the air felt heavy, charged. I finally understood the sequence of events. 1. Ghost smelled the key container hidden outside the foundation, right where Vance's watch point was. The smell. 2. I removed the key, disrupting the physical arrangement, the disturbance. 3. The ghost, or the residual trauma of Vance, was alerted that his hiding place, the crawl space, had been compromised. 4. An agent, either human or spectral, entered the house to deliver the map to the key, forcing me to retrieve the documents, thus ensuring I learned the history of Project Nightwatch, the delivery. 5. Now that I knew the history, the presence had escalated. It wasn't just detection anymore, it was communication. I looked at the word scratched into the wall. Hiding. I looked at the key in my pocket, the one that unlocked the box of secrets. I looked at the coin in my hand, the final message left by the tormented sentry. The secret wasn't just the history of Project Nightwatch. The secret was what Vance had been hiding in the box. I rushed back to the kitchen, opening the wooden chest. I flipped through the journal again, searching for any mention of the key, the coin, or what he might have buried. I found a separate sheet of paper stuck to the back cover of the journal with dried glue. It was a final, undated entry, written right before he was moved out of the barracks. "They are coming to move me. They think I failed, but I won. I beat the threat. I realized it wasn't an external enemy. The threat is the program itself. It's what they are doing. I had to hide the evidence. I put the papers and the key in the vessel outside, under the foundation. The key is to the last thing they made me look at. The thing they said was the ultimate defense. I don't know what it is, but I know it's alive, and it shouldn't be here. It's in the only place they would never look. Box 502, the safe deposit box. I pray Amelia finds this. Box 502, the safe deposit box." The key I had just pulled out of the ground was not for the wooden chest. It was for a bank box, and inside that box was the last thing they made him look at, the ultimate defense, and Vance believed it was alive. I looked at the silver dime, the 1943 coin. I realized what I had to do next. I had to find a bank that used a 502 safety deposit box and find out what PFC Thomas A. Vance had been forced to stare at until he broke. "Sarah," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "Get dressed. We're going for a drive. We need to find this bank and we need to do it before dawn." We left the house immediately. I didn't want Ghost spending another minute staring down that hallway. We took the wooden box, the journal, the key, and the dime. As we backed out of the driveway, I glanced up at the guest room window. The light was still flickering, a sickly yellow pulse in the darkness. And then, right as I turned the corner onto the main street, I heard Ghost, sitting silently in the back seat, let out a deep, mournful howl, a sound I hadn't heard since we lost 3 good men in a single, devastating blast overseas. It was the sound of a sentry confirming a body count. I pushed the gas pedal down hard. We were done trying to understand the ghost of a soldier. Now, we had to find out what he had buried. The real secret was waiting for us inside Box 502. I hit the gas pedal hard, swinging the truck onto the main road. Ghost, who had been silent and professional for the last hour, settled down in the back seat, but that final mournful howl still echoed in the cab. It wasn't the sound of pain or even fear. It was the sound of recognition. A final salute to a fallen comrade. "Cal, slow down," Sarah pleaded, clutching the wooden box on her lap. "Where are we going? We can't just drive up to a bank in the middle of the night." "We're going to find out what Vance was so afraid of that he had to bury the key to it," I said, checking the rearview mirror for any headlights that might be following us, an old habit that was suddenly feeling very necessary. "And you're right, we can't go to a bank, but I know a few people who can open doors that are supposed to stay locked." I pulled out my phone and dialed a number I hadn't used in months. It was 1 a.m., but Mac, my old sergeant, always answered. He lived on German time anyway. He picked up on the second ring, his voice gritty with sleep. "Jenkins, you better not be calling about a bad brisket recipe again." "Mac, it's not brisket. It's a priority one, historical. I need a favor now. It involves Fort Bragg, 1956, and something called Project Nightwatch." There was a heavy silence on the line. Mac didn't talk about the old days much, especially the weird stuff. "Nightwatch?" he finally asked. "That's a deep file, Cal. What the hell did you dig up?" I gave him the condensed version. The house on the old annex land, Ghost's reaction, the buried box, the letters about PFC Vance, and the safe deposit key stamped 502. Vance was the original sentry, Mac. They broke him trying to perfect the program. He hid the key to a safe deposit box before they moved him out. He wrote that whatever is in that box is the ultimate defense, and that it's alive. I need to know which bank used that key number back then. Mac whistled, a long, low sound of professional disbelief. "You know how many safe deposit boxes there are in North Carolina?" Even back in the 50s, that's a needle in a haystack, Cal. Not if it's a military bank, I pressed. It would be near the annex, or maybe a credit union that served the base. That key isn't commercial. It's too heavy duty. Mac told me to hold on. I could hear the tap of keys on a computer, then the rustle of papers. He was pulling up old records, using his access to the institutional memory of the Army's K-9 Corps, which often overlapped with the less savory historical projects. 5 minutes later, he was back. "Okay, Jenkins, you got lucky. The Fort Bragg Federal Credit Union used to have a satellite branch right off the old annex perimeter. They merged in '78, and all the safe deposit box records were transferred to their main archive in Charlotte. They use a specific type of brass key, just like you described. Charlotte? That's 4 hours away. It's the only shot you have, Cal. Those archives open at 8 a.m. I'm going to call in a favor with a buddy who's still connected to the bank's security team. Tell them you're an authorized investigator for a historical repatriation case. Use my name, Sergeant Major McLean. You're risking your pension for this, Mac. I'm risking my pension because I know Ghost. If that dog is howling, it means the threat is real, even if it's 60 years old. Now get moving. And Cal, be careful. If this is tied to Night Watch, there are people who still want those files buried." I thanked Mac and hung up. I looked over at Sarah, who had listened to the whole conversation with wide eyes. "Charlotte, North Carolina," I announced, turning onto the interstate. "We're chasing a ghost into a bank archive." The drive was long and silent. The moon sank, and the sky began to lighten. Ghost stayed awake, occasionally letting out a quiet, rumbling sigh but remaining calm. He was working the problem, just like me. We arrived in Charlotte just as the sun was rising, painting the glass towers of the banking district in a sickly orange glow. The archive building was huge, modern, and intimidating. At 7:55 a.m., we were standing at the front desk. Sarah looked exhausted, but her grip on the box was firm. I looked like a homeless man who had wrestled a badger, dusty jeans, scraped knuckles, and an intense, manic focus. The security guard tried to send us away. "Sir, the archives require an appointment, and you can't bring that antique box inside." "I have an appointment," I said, leaning in and using the low, authoritative voice I used to clear rooms. "Call Mr. Thompson in security. Tell him Sergeant Major McLean sent me. I'm here regarding Box 502, a matter of national security and historical repatriation." The guard looked at the box, then at Ghost, who was sitting perfectly still, radiating an energy that made the guard visibly nervous. He made the call. 10 minutes later, a nervous man in an expensive suit, Mr. Thompson, met us in the lobby. He was middle-aged, balding, and clearly uncomfortable being awake this early dealing with a dusty man and a Belgian, Malinois. "Sergeant Major Jenkins," he said, extending a clammy hand. "I've spoken with Mr. McLean. He assures me this is legitimate, but I must warn you these archives are highly restricted. What exactly are we looking for?" I didn't mince words. I placed the wooden box on a marble table and opened it, showing him the faded military reports and Vance's frantic journal. I laid out the brass key. "We believe this box contains evidence of a highly sensitive, classified experiment conducted on a soldier in 1956, I explained. The soldier, PFC Vance, hid this key to prevent the device from being used again. We need to access Box 502 immediately." Thompson's face went from annoyed to horrified as he skimmed the official Army documents. He clearly realized this was above his pay grade. "The bank is liable for the contents of these boxes," he stammered. "We need a court order, or, at least, a high-level command from the Department of Defense." "You have a command from a sergeant major who has enough pull to make your life very difficult, Mr. Thompson," I cut in, maintaining eye contact. "And every minute we waste, whatever is in that box is potentially still operating, causing harm. Now, lead the way." Thompson swallowed hard. He looked at Ghost, who let out a soft, warning growl. The dog knew we were close. "Fine," Thompson sighed. "But the dog stays outside the vault." I gave Ghost a command, and he lay down outside the heavy steel doors, his head resting on his paws, but his eyes tracking every movement. We were led deep into the sublevels of the building, through layers of security and into a massive, cold vault. Row upon row of metal safe deposit boxes lined the walls, each one a silent tomb holding someone's secrets. Thompson led us to a section labeled Historical Acquisitions, 1940-1979. He found the box, a small dark metal container marked 502. My heart was pounding. This was it. The culmination of Vance's terror, Ghost's vigilance, and the secret someone broke into my house to make sure I found. Thompson inserted his master key. I inserted the brass key. The lock turned with a loud, final click. Thompson slid the box out and placed it on the small steel table. It was heavy, heavier than it looked. Sarah and I leaned over it. I took a deep breath, preparing myself for money, drugs, or perhaps an antique weapon. I lifted the lid. The box was lined with old, brittle padding. Inside, there was no gold, no jewelry, and no stacks of cash. There was only a single object, wrapped tightly in a thick gray canvas cloth that looked like old military surplus. I reached in and carefully lifted the canvas bundle. It was about the size of a loaf of bread, surprisingly dense. I pulled back the canvas. It wasn't a weapon in the traditional sense, it was a machine. It looked like a piece of 1950s radio equipment, bulky and built with heavy black metal casing. It had a series of dials, glowing green vacuum tubes, and a small segmented antenna that was folded flat against the top. The casing was stamped with a faded military serial number, and above the number, stenciled in white paint, were the words, Project Nightwatch, Threat Stimulus Generator, TSG, Unit 1. Thompson looked confused. "What is that? A radio?" "It's the machine that drove PFC Vance insane," I whispered, staring at the device. I remembered Vance's journal entry. I realized it wasn't an external enemy. The threat is the program itself. The ultimate defense wasn't something to be used against an enemy. It was the mechanism used to create the ultimate sentry. And it was exactly what it sounded like. A generator that produced the sensory anomaly, the threat that Vance was trained to detect. I ran my fingers over the casing. It felt cold, unnaturally cold, just like the air in the guest bedroom. And then I saw it. Tucked next to the main power switch, a tiny, almost invisible light was pulsing. A dull, rhythmic red glow. "It's active," I said, the realization chilling me to the bone. "This thing is still running." "How can it be running?" Thompson asked, terrified. "It's been locked away since the 1950s. Where is it getting power?" I flipped the device over. On the bottom, there was a heavy, sealed compartment labeled Power Cell. "They built this thing to last," I explained, the mechanics of it instantly familiar from my EOD training. "They probably used an early form of a radioisotope thermoelectric generator. A tiny, long-life nuclear battery. It's designed to run for decades without maintenance." But why was it still running? Vance had risked everything to hide the key. If he wanted the project shut down, why didn't he simply destroy the TSG? I looked back at the journal entry. "The key is to the last thing they made me look at. The thing they said was the ultimate defense. The TSG Unit 1 was the control unit. It had the dials and the antenna for tuning the frequency of the threat. But the complexity of the design suggested it was the master transmitter, not the local one." I pulled out Vance's floor plan sketch from the wooden box. I found the diagram of Barracks 3, Section C, our house. The sketch didn't show the TSG. It showed the vents, the wiring, and the location of the isolation cell. And then I found a separate note tucked into the spine of the journal, written in the neat cursive of Vance's friend, Jay. Amelia. They had to install the emitter in the structure itself. Vance couldn't detect the threat if it was coming from outside the walls. The generator is remote, but the final broadcast unit is built into the hallway wall near the utility access. They sealed it up after the breakdown. If they can't find the generator, they can't turn off the field. The hair on my arms stood up. The TSG Unit 1 in the safe deposit box was the remote generator, the machine that created the signal. But the device that was actually broadcasting the signal, the emitter, was still sealed inside the wall of my house. The cold spot, the hum, the feeling of being watched. Ghost wasn't detecting a ghost. He was detecting an active, low-frequency electromagnetic field designed to induce sensory overload and terror. This also explained the break-in. Someone had entered the house, discovered that the emitter was still active, and realized the key to the control unit was still missing. They left the map to the key, forcing me to find the TSG Unit 1. "Why?" Sarah whispered, looking from the letters to the buzzing machine. "Why would someone want us to find this?" I carefully picked up the TSG Unit 1. The metal was heavy and cold in my hands. They didn't want us to find it to shut it down, I realized, a cold dread settling in my gut. They wanted us to find it because they lost it. They need the control unit. If the emitter in my wall was still running on residual power, imagine what the full-power generator could do if someone activated it right there, in my house. "Mr. Thompson," I said, turning to the terrified bank manager. "This device is coming with me. It is classified military property and I am taking it into custody." Thompson was too shocked to argue. He just nodded dumbly. We walked out of the vault, past Ghost. The minute the dog saw the TSG Unit 1, he didn't growl or whine. He just stood up, rigid, and let out a single, sharp huff, the sound of a sentry recognizing a lethal threat. We got back in the truck. The sun was fully up now, but the day felt darker than the night. "What do we do now, Cal?" Sarah asked as we sped back toward the interstate. "We go home and we find that emitter," I said, placing the TSG Unit 1 carefully in the wooden box next to the journal. "But first, we figure out who else knew about this box." I asked Sarah to check the bank documents Thompson had given us, the records of Box 502. She skimmed the photocopied ledger sheet. It was registered in 1957. Name: PFC Thomas A. Vance. Status: active until 1978, when it was listed as abandoned property and moved to the archive. The rental fee hasn't been paid since 1958. So, nobody has touched it in decades, I confirmed, except maybe the bank archivists. "Wait," Sarah said, running her finger down the column. "There's a note here, dated 3 weeks ago. It says, 'Inquiry made regarding Box 502 status. Caller identified as Dr. E. R. Thorne, private researcher.' 3 weeks ago, right when we moved in, right when Ghost started staring at the wall. Dr. Thorne," I repeated. "He wasn't trying to break into the house to steal the key. He was trying to figure out if the key had ever been recovered. When he found out the key was still missing, he went to the house, found the map, and made sure I found the key. But why? Because the TSG Unit 1 is the control for the emitter in my wall," I explained, "and if that emitter is still running, it's probably running at a fraction of its power. If Dr. Thorne gets his hands on this generator, he can dial up the frequency. He can turn the threat from a cold spot into a weapon." I pulled out Vance's journal again, flipping to the final, frantic entry. Vance had written that the threat was alive. He meant the program. But he also wrote, "It's in the only place they would never look." The safe deposit box was one place. The other, the emitter, was in my wall. We had the generator. We had to get back to the house, find the emitter, and destroy both devices before Dr. Thorne found us. I called Mac back. I told him about the TSG Unit 1 and Dr. Thorne. Mac was furious. "Thorne? I know that name. He was a protege of one of the original Night Watch scientists, He disappeared from the Army's radar 20 years ago. He was obsessed with restarting the sensory warfare program. He thinks he can weaponize human fear. Well, he knows where I live now, Mac, and he knows I have the control unit. Get out of North Carolina, Cal. Drive to a military base, any base, and hand that device over to CID immediately. I can't, I said, gripping the steering wheel. The emitter is still in my wall. If I leave, Thorne will go to the house, find the emitter, and God knows what he'll do to Sarah if she's there. I have to go back and finish this. Mac knew that tone. It was the tone of a soldier who had already decided the course of action. All right, Cal. I'll run Thorne's name through the system, see if I can get a current location, but don't wait for me. Assume he's already on his way. We were only an hour from home when the truck started acting up. It was a slow, subtle thing at first. The radio, which had been playing static, suddenly went dead silent. The speedometer needle started twitching erratically. "What's wrong?" Sarah asked nervously. "Electromagnetic. Interference," I muttered. I looked down at the wooden box on the seat between us. The TSG Unit 1. It was wrapped in heavy canvas, but the device was powerful. I pulled over to the shoulder, popping the hood. Everything looked fine. The engine was purring. But as soon as I got out of the truck, I felt it. The air was heavy, charged, and I heard the faint, almost subsonic hum, the signature frequency of the threat stimulus. Ghost, still in the back seat, let out a low, continuous moan. He was terrified. I rushed back inside the truck. "We're too close," I told Sarah. "The TSG Unit 1 is interacting with the emitter at the house. It's like two magnets fighting each other." I picked up the TSG Unit 1 and examined the vacuum tubes. They were glowing brighter now, pulsing with the frequency of the hum. "He's here," I said, looking out the windshield. "Thorne is here, or he's close enough to activate the emitter." I saw a car parked about 100 yards up the road, pulled into a small wooded turnout. It was a nondescript dark sedan. I grabbed my binoculars from the glove compartment. I focused on the car. The windows were tinted, but I saw movement inside. Someone was sitting there watching the road. "That's him," I confirmed. "He was waiting for me to come back. He knew I'd find the control unit." Thorne wasn't interested in the device. He was interested in what I would do with the device. He wanted to force me into the house with the TSG Unit 1, where he could control the situation. "We need to get off the road," I said, backing the truck onto a muddy dirt track hidden by pine trees. We drove for about a quarter-mile until we were completely hidden from the road. I killed the engine. I opened the back door for Ghost. He jumped out, immediately going into Sentinel mode, circling the truck, sniffing the air. He was focused, not scared anymore. He was working. I pulled the TSG Unit 1 out of the box and placed it on the driver's seat. I needed to figure out how to shut it down, or at least neutralize the signal. The dials were labeled with cryptic military jargon: sensory acuity, frequency shift, and amplitude. If I turned the amplitude dial down, maybe I could stop the transmission. I reached out to touch the dial, but Ghost suddenly barked, a sharp, aggressive warning bark aimed not at the woods, but at the truck. He lunged at the TSG Unit 1, his teeth snapping inches from the metal casing. "No, Ghost, heel!" I yelled, pulling him back by the harness. Ghost resisted fiercely, whining and trying to get back to the device. He was trying to destroy it. "He knows," Sarah whispered, her face pale. "He knows this is the threat." I realized that if I tried to manipulate the controls, I might accidentally boost the signal instead of dampening it. And if I boosted the signal, I could overload the emitter in the house, or worse, overload Ghost's already stressed sensory system. I looked at the power cell compartment. It was sealed with heavy bolts. I had my tools, but it would take time to access the battery, and I didn't have time. "We have to use this as bait," I decided. "Thorne wants the generator. We'll give it to him, but only when we're ready." I grabbed the silver dime Vance had left on the nightstand and slipped it into my pocket. We're going to approach the house from the back, through the woods. We need to find that emitter in the wall and neutralize it first. If we can kill the target, the generator is just a lump of metal. We started hiking through the dense undergrowth, heading back toward our property line. Ghost was leading the way, silently tracking the ground. He was moving with the coiled intensity of a dog on a live mission. When we reached the fence line, I knelt down. Our house was visible through the trees, quiet and seemingly normal. The emitter is in the hallway wall, near the utility access, I whispered to Sarah, showing her the sketch Jay had left. It's right above the sealed crawlspace where I found the key. How do we get it out without tearing the whole house apart? We don't, I said. We get to the crawlspace from the outside. That's the utility area they mentioned in the letter. If the emitter is built into the wall, we might be able to access the wiring from below, where it connects to the power source. We moved along the fence until we reached the back of the guest bedroom. The morning dew was heavy and the air was still cold. I found the spot where I had pried off the metal plate the night before. I had left the plate lying next to the foundation. I pulled the plate aside and shone my flashlight into the small void. The TSG Unit 1 was back in the truck, but the hum was still here, faint but persistent. I slid into the crawlspace. It was dusty and cramped. I swept the beam up the concrete wall. The concrete foundation met the wooden floor joists of the guest bedroom above me. And there it was. Tucked between two joists, right where the wall of the hallway would be above me, was a small, crudely installed access panel. It was sealed tight with caulk and screws. The hum was loudest here. I pulled out my crowbar and went to work. The caulk was old and brittle. It took 5 minutes of heavy, quiet effort, but the panel finally gave way with a splintering sound. I shone the flashlight into the new opening. Inside the wall cavity, nestled in old insulation, was a second device. This one was smaller than the TSG Unit 1, but clearly related. It was a black box about the size of a cigar box with a series of heavy wires leading up into the structure of the house. This was the emitter, the final broadcast unit. And it was humming, vibrating slightly against the wooden joist. I could see where the wires led. One set went up into the wall cavity, probably running the sensory frequency up and down the hallway, creating the cold spot. The other set led down, disappearing into the concrete foundation. It's drawing power from the foundation, I whispered, recognizing the setup. They probably ran a dedicated line for the TSG and then sealed it up. It's got its own power source, independent of the house's electricity. I needed to sever the connection. I pulled out my heavy-duty wire cutters, but before I could reach the wires, I heard a sound outside the crawlspace opening. A low, smooth voice. "I wouldn't do that, Sergeant Major. You might interrupt the signal at a critical moment." I froze. Dr. Thorne. I backed up slowly, pulling myself out of the crawlspace opening. Dr. Thorne was standing 10 feet away, holding a small silver pistol aimed directly at my chest. He was a thin, meticulously dressed man in his late 60s, wearing a tweed jacket that looked utterly out of place in the North Carolina woods. He looked like an academic, not a threat, but the pistol was steady. Ghost was standing between us, low to the ground, his teeth bared in a silent snarl. He was waiting for my command. "Ghost, stay," I commanded softly, stepping out from behind the dog. "Ah, the Malinois," Thorne said, his eyes gleaming with professional interest. "Remarkable fidelity. A perfect sentry, just like our poor PFC Vance." "You understand now, Jenkins, don't you? The dog wasn't detecting a ghost. He was detecting my machine." "It's Vance's machine, Doctor," I corrected, "and you drove him insane with it. A necessary sacrifice for the ultimate defense," Thorne dismissed, waving the gun slightly. "Where is Unit 1, the remote generator? I know you found the key." "It's secure," I lied, "and you're too late. I know what you're trying to do. You want to activate the system." Weaponize the frequency and drive an entire population into a state of hyper-vigilance and terror. Thorne smiled, a cold, empty expression. Terror? No, Jenkins. Control. Imagine an army that never sleeps, that detects every subtle threat before it manifests. Vance was the prototype. You and your dog are the modern equivalents. And now, I need to complete the research. He took a step closer. I need the control unit, Jenkins. The emitter in the wall is running at less than 10% capacity. It's just creating a localized cold spot of fear. But with Unit 1, I can boost the amplitude and frequency. I can restart Project Nightwatch. You broke into my house, I accused. You left the map. I merely guided you to the evidence, Thorne corrected, his voice still unnervingly calm. I've been monitoring the abandoned emitter for 20 years. When I realized the key was still missing, I needed someone with the resources and the intuition to find it. A former MWD handler was the perfect candidate. He gestured with the pistol toward the house. Now, where's the TSG Unit 1? In the truck. Go get it, slowly. I started walking toward the road, Ghost glued to my side. Don't try anything foolish, Jenkins. My research is complete. I know exactly how your dog's sensory system works. If you try to command him to attack, we'll simply adjust the frequency on the emitter in the wall, and I guarantee you, the dog will collapse from sensory overload before he takes 3 steps. I stopped. He had me. He had control of the local environment. Sarah is still here, I said, trying to buy time. I know, Thorne said patiently. She's sitting quietly by the window. She's not an immediate threat. Unlike you, she is not currently carrying the primary control unit to my life's work. We reached the truck. I opened the passenger door, reaching for the wooden box. Now, step back, Jenkins. I pulled out the wooden box and set it on the ground. I opened the lid, revealing the heavy humming TSG Unit 1. Thorne's eyes lit up with pure scientific ecstasy. Beautiful, after all these years. He took one step toward the box. That was all the space I needed. My training isn't just about explosives and tracking. It's about managing threats. And I had one move left. I didn't reach for the gun. I reached for the one thing Thorne hadn't anticipated, the silver dime. I pulled the coin from my pocket and threw it, hard, into the open crawlspace where the emitter was exposed. The coin hit the emitter box with a loud clang. The moment the metal of the coin struck the emitter, the humming sound vanished. The air pressure in the woods dropped instantly. No! Thorne roared, his composure shattering as he realized what I had done. You've shorted the field. Ghost didn't wait for my command. The sensory weight was gone. He launched himself at Thorne, a silent black missile of muscle and teeth. Thorne, distracted by the loss of his machine, fired the pistol wildly. The shot went wide, hitting the dirt track behind me. Ghost slammed into Thorne's chest, knocking the older man backward onto the wet leaves. The pistol skittered away into the undergrowth. I didn't wait. I ran back to the crawl space, grabbed my wire cutters, and plunged them into the exposed wires of the emitter box. Crack! The wires sparked violently. The humming was completely gone. The cold spot, the hum, the invisible threat that had haunted my house for 3 weeks, it was dead. I scrambled back out of the crawl space. Ghost had Thorne pinned down, his teeth clamped around the man's tweed jacket collar, holding him immobile, but not harming him. Ghost was a precision instrument. I walked over and kicked the scattered pistol further into the woods. Thorne was spitting mad, but his voice was weak. You destroyed decades of work, the ultimate defense. You created a torture device, Doctor, I corrected, placing my foot on his chest to keep him still. And now, the only active part of Project Nightwatch is just a piece of junk, metal. I walked back to the truck, leaving Thorne sputtering on the ground with Ghost standing guard over him. The old man was defeated, not by a physical force but by the loss of his life's work. The silence in the woods was now absolute, the good kind, No hum, no charged air, just the rustle of the pine needles. Sarah came running out of the house, having watched the whole messy confrontation from the window. She looked at Thorn, then at Ghost, then at me, covered in dust and sweat. "Is it over?" she asked, her voice shaking slightly. "It's over," I confirmed, pulling the wire cutters from my pocket. "The emitter is dead. The threat is gone." I walked back to Thorn and retrieved the small silver pistol he'd dropped. I checked the clip and tossed the weapon deep into the woods. Then I used the heavy-duty zip ties I always kept in the truck. You never know when you need to secure a casualty or an asset, and tied Thorn's hands and feet securely. "You have no idea what you've done, Jenkins," Thorn hissed, looking up at me with pure venom. "You've condemned us all to ignorance. You've destroyed the future of sensory defense." "You destroyed a man, Doctor," I countered, tightening the last zip tie around his ankles. "And you tried to use his trauma to hurt my family. That's not defense. That's just cruelty." I left Thorn lying there, a pathetic, tweed-clad lump of disappointment, and went straight to the truck. I called Mac again. "I have the target," I said simply. "TSG Unit 1 is recovered. The emitter is neutralized. I also have the subject, Dr. E.R. Thorn, secured on my property. I need a clean pickup. No local police. I need CID now." Mac didn't ask questions. "Stay put, Cal. I'm coordinating a field team out of Fort Bragg. They'll be there in 90 minutes. Do not move the device." I hung up and looked at Sarah. "We have 90 minutes to finish the job inside the house." We went back to the crawl space. I needed to remove the emitter completely. I crawled back into the cramped, dark space, pulling the small black box out of the wall cavity. It was cold to the touch and completely inert. I clipped the remaining wires and pulled the device free. It was heavier than I expected. When I flipped it over, I saw why. It wasn't just a broadcast unit. It was the terminal end of the system, complete with a small, heavily shielded antenna and several internal capacitors. This was the source of the cold spot and the hum that had tormented Vance. I carried the dead emitter back into the house, placing it next to the wooden box containing the TSG Unit 1 on the kitchen counter. "It looks like a piece of junk," Sarah observed, poking the emitter cautiously with a wooden spoon. "It's the reason Ghost was staring at the hallway," I said, running my hand over the dark metal. It was running a low-frequency field, creating a sensory anomaly. Ghost was just doing what he was trained to do: detect the subtle threat. The relief flooding the house was palpable. The air felt lighter. The silence was back to being the good, peaceful kind. Ghost walked into the kitchen, sniffed the dead emitter and the TSG Unit 1, and then, completely satisfied, he walked over to his water bowl and took a long, noisy drink. He was done working. The mission was complete. Now I needed to deal with the primary threat, the TSG Unit 1. Mac had told me not to move it, but I couldn't leave a nuclear-powered generator running in my kitchen, even a tiny one. I put on a pair of heavy leather gloves. "Sarah, stand back. I need to dismantle the power cell. On this thing. If it's running off an RTG, it needs to be handled properly." I flipped the TSG Unit 1 over. The power compartment was bolted shut, just as I'd seen in the bank vault. I used a screwdriver to carefully remove the thick, rusted bolts. As I worked, I thought about Vance. He hadn't destroyed the control unit. He had hidden it, knowing that by removing the controls he neutralized the emitter in the wall, turning the system into a benign, cold spot. He had sacrificed himself to save the world from this technology. The final bolt came loose. I carefully pried open the panel. Inside, nestled in thick lead shielding, was the power source, a small, sealed cylinder, glowing faintly blue in the shadows. It was the RTG, tiny but powerful enough to run the device for 70 years. I used a pair of insulated pliers to carefully pull the cylinder free. The moment it disconnected, the glowing vacuum tubes on the TSG Unit 1 flickered once and died. The machine was silent. Just a lump of black metal now. I placed the RTG power cell into a heavy lead container I kept in the garage, another relic of my EOD days used for storing sensitive components. "That's it," I announced, wiping the sweat from my brow. "Project Nightwatch is officially offline." We spent the next half hour cleaning up the evidence. I pulled the wooden box, the journal, the letters, the TSG Unit 1, the dead emitter, and the lead container of the power cell, and piled them neatly in the center of the kitchen floor. "What about the letters?" Sarah asked, holding Vance's journal protectively. "The military can't just take his story and bury it again." "They won't," I promised. "I'm turning over the hardware and Thorn. But Vance's story, the letters, the journal, the evidence of their psychological warfare, that stays with us. That's classified history, but it's also proof of human courage. We'll make sure that gets archived somewhere safe, maybe a university library, not the Pentagon." At exactly 9:30 a.m., a convoy of 3 black, unmarked SUVs pulled up the long driveway. Out stepped 4 men in standard military field uniforms, led by a stern-faced major from Criminal Investigation Division, CID. The major, a woman named Reynolds, was all business. She didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Sergeant Major Jenkins, where is the asset?" I led her team out to the woods. They quickly assessed Thorn, confirmed his identity, and efficiently placed him on a stretcher for transport. They were clinical and silent, treating him like a biohazard. "The devices are in the kitchen, Major," I said, leading them back to the house. Reynolds surveyed the pile of equipment on my floor. The dead TSG, Unit 1, the emitter, and the lead container. She took one look at Vance's journal sitting next to the pile, and her eyes narrowed. "The documents, Jenkins. All classified material must be surrendered." "The documents are my property, Major," I stated, standing firm. "The hardware is yours. The documents detail the psychological breakdown of PFC Vance and the subsequent cover-up. They are not critical to your counterintelligence operation. They are historical records, and they belong to the public domain, not the military's secret files." Reynolds looked like she was ready to argue, but she glanced at the TSG Unit 1, then at the RTG container. She knew the priority was securing the technology and the scientist. Arguing over 60-year-old letters wasn't worth the delay. "We will discuss the disposition of the documents later, Sergeant Major," she said, her voice tight. "For now, we are securing the hardware and the suspect." Her team carefully packaged the TSG Unit 1 and the emitter. They took the lead container with the RTG power cell. Within 20 minutes, the kitchen was clean, and the CID team was gone, disappearing as silently as they had arrived. The only things left on my counter were the wooden box, Vance's journal, and the small, tarnished silver dime. I looked at Sarah. She was leaning against the counter, suddenly. Looking 10 years younger, the tension finally gone from her shoulders. "It's quiet," she said, almost a question. "It's quiet," I agreed. I looked down the hallway. It was just a beige corridor now. The shadows didn't seem ominous. The light at the end was just dim because the bulb needed replacing. Ghost walked up to the entrance of the hallway, sniffed the air one last time, and then turned his back on it completely. He trotted over to the couch, jumped up, something he rarely did, and curled into a tight, relaxed ball. He closed his eyes, and, for the first time in 3 weeks, he was genuinely asleep. The sentry was finally relieved of duty. The next few days were surreal. I spent my time patching the hole in the crawlspace wall and sealing the exterior access point permanently. I replaced the floorboards in the hallway where Vance had etched his watch point. We scrubbed the word "hiding" off the guest room wall and repainted the entire room a bright, cheerful yellow, banishing the desert sand color forever. Life returned to normal, but it was a new normal. We had been through a war in our own home, and we had won. A week later, Mac called me. "Thorn is in custody at Leavenworth, Jenkins. He's facing a laundry list of charges, including unauthorized research, theft of government property, and reckless endangerment. He won't be bothering anyone again. And the TSG Unit 1? Decommissioned. The RTG is being handled by the appropriate agencies. Project Nightwatch is officially terminated. You saved the Army a lot of embarrassment, Cal. And you saved your dog. What about Vance? I asked. Did you find any records of what happened to him after 1957? Mac paused. We found a few things. PFC Thomas A. Vance was officially discharged in 1958 with a full disability. Pension, listed as having suffered a severe non-combat stress reaction. He was moved to a VA facility outside of Asheville, where he lived until 1985. His records confirm he spent 30 years in a near catatonic state, staring at the wall of his room, waiting for the threat to arrive. He never broke the conditioning. I closed my eyes. 30 years. That was the true cost of Project Nightwatch. We found his friend, Jay, too, Mac continued. He was discharged shortly after Vance, but he went underground. We believe he was the one who, decades later, realized the emitter was still running on your property, and he orchestrated the whole sequence, the burial of the key, the break-in, the map, to force the system to be exposed and shut down. He risked everything, I said, looking at the journal. He was a good soldier, Cal. Just like Vance. Just like Ghost. They were all trying to guard the same secrets, one way or another. I didn't tell Mac that I had found the small final piece of the puzzle that gave Vance his closure. I had been sitting in the living room one quiet afternoon, holding the silver dime. I remembered Vance's journal entry about the coin being his lucky charm, the thing he constantly rubbed during testing. I took the dime and placed it back on the kitchen counter. Then I took the heavy brass skeleton key, the key to Box 502, and walked out to the backyard. I found the massive old oak tree. I walked past the fence line and kept going, into the woods that backed up to our property. I dug a small deep hole with a trowel, far from any foundation, far from any military annex. I placed the heavy brass key inside the hole. It was the key to the ultimate defense, the key to the machine that created terror. It didn't belong to the military, and it certainly didn't belong to me. I covered the hole, smoothing the dirt over it. When I came back inside, I picked up Vance's journal. I read the final scrawled word one last time. Waiting. I took the journal and the letters, walked to my safe, and locked them away. They were safe now, preserved, waiting for the right moment to tell the world the story of PFC Thomas A. Vance. I walked back to the kitchen, picked up the silver dime, and tossed it into the small, wooden bowl where Sarah and I kept our loose change. The mystery was solved. The threat was neutralized. Ghost was finally truly home. But the story of Ghost in the hallway had fundamentally changed me. I wasn't just a retired sergeant major anymore, trying to find quiet. I was a custodian of a terrible secret and a witness to the profound, almost spiritual loyalty that exists between a soldier and his partner. I realized that Ghost wasn't just sensing the machine. He was sensing the residue of military conditioning, the absolute, unrelenting duty that had been drilled into Vance and then into him. Ghost saw his own reflection in that terrified, broken soldier, and that was the final, devastating truth. My perfect sentry, the dog who saved my life a dozen times, was carrying the exact same psychological burden as PFC Vance. Ghost's staring was a silent plea for me to recognize the threat, not just to the house, but to his own sanity. Now, with the hum gone, the fear faded, and the TSG Unit 1 destroyed, Ghost was free. I walked into the living room and sat down on the couch next to my dog. He didn't stir, but his breathing was deep and even. He was dreaming of rabbits, or maybe just silence. I rested my hand on his head, feeling the thick, warm fur. "You're safe, buddy," I whispered. "We're both safe." But I knew the military mind, and I knew how deep the desire for the ultimate defense ran. Thorn was gone, but the idea of Project Nightwatch wasn't, and there was one last thing. A few days later, I was cleaning out the guest bedroom closet, preparing to turn it into a proper office. I was vacuuming the floor when I noticed something under the baseboard. It was a small, crudely folded piece of paper stuck in the gap where the wall met the floor. It was too small to have been part of the documents in the box. I pulled it out. It was a recent piece of paper, maybe a week old, folded into a tight square. I unfolded it. It was a note, written in a clean, professional hand. It wasn't signed by Thorn. It wasn't signed by Jay. The note simply read, "Sergeant Jenkins, you chose correctly. The original TSG Unit 1 is destroyed, but you must understand, the program was never about the machine. It was about the T-Mind. The next phase will not require hardware. The lessons learned from Vance are now applied elsewhere. Stay vigilant. The watch continues." And below that, a single word, etched with chilling precision: Night Watch. I crumpled the note in my hand. The military hadn't just broken Vance. They had learned from him. They had moved beyond the physical machine and were now perfecting the conditioning itself. I looked down at Ghost, sleeping, peacefully on the couch. He might be safe from the emitter in the wall, but he was still the perfect sentry. And if the program was truly about the mind, then Ghost himself was the ultimate living weapon, and someone out there still knew he existed. I didn't tell Sarah about the note. I didn't tell Mac. I burned the paper in the backyard fire pit, watching the smoke curl into the clear North Carolina sky. I went back inside and sat down, my hand resting protectively on Ghost's harness. The silence was good, yes, but I knew now that silence was just the absence of sound. It wasn't the absence of threat. We had solved the mystery of the hallway, but we had opened the door to a much larger, more dangerous secret. And I knew, deep down in my bones, that my retirement was far from over. I was a sentry, and Ghost was my shadow. And the watch continues. We were ready for the next phase, whatever it was, whenever it came. We had the quiet now, but we would never mistake it for peace. It's been 6 months since Major Reynolds and her crew packed up the last piece of junk metal and hauled Dr. Thorn away. 6 months of real, honest-to-God quiet. We never heard another official word about Project Nightwatch. Mac assured me that Vance's journal and letters were quietly deposited into the archives of a major university library. Not under the Army's name, but under a vague, historical donation. Vance's story, the story of the sentry who broke but still won the war, was preserved. The house is just a house now. We replaced the old beige carpet runner with a nice, dark hardwood floor. Sarah planted a new azalea bush right next to where the crawlspace used to be. The guest bedroom is painted a welcoming shade of blue. There are no cold spots, no hums, no flickering lights. And Ghost. He's the happiest dog in North Carolina. He still runs the yard like it's his perimeter, but when the sun goes down, he curls up on the rug in the living room and he sleeps. Really sleeps. No more shallow breathing, no more ears rotated backward, listening to the dust settle. The constant burden of the threat stimulus is gone. He's a retired military dog who finally got his retirement. But I never forgot the final note I burned in the fire. Pit. The program was never about the machine. It was about the mind. I learned that the military didn't need a buzzing black box in my wall to create a sentry. They needed absolute focus, absolute duty, and the unwavering conviction that failure meant death. That was the real legacy of Nightwatch, and that was the core of my partnership with Ghost. So, while the house is quiet, I am not. I still keep the wooden box on a high shelf in the garage, a reminder of the secret we unearthed. And every morning, when I pour my coffee, I see Vance's tarnished silver dime sitting in the loose change bowl. A small, cold reminder that the cost of vigilance is eternal. I spend my days working on the ranch, but I've added new routines. I check the perimeter fences twice a day. I vary my route to the grocery store. I carry the same level of situational awareness that I did overseas, only now I apply it to suburban traffic and neighborhood gossip. I'm not looking for a black box anymore. I'm looking for the subtle shift in the air, the anomaly that Vance saw, the one that tells you the program is evolving. Ghost is my anchor. He is the quiet stability that grounds me, but he is also my early warning. One recent evening, we were sitting on the back porch, watching the late summer lightning flash silently miles away over the mountains. Ghost was resting his head on my knee, completely relaxed. A car drove by too fast down the street, its stereo vibrating the glass in the window. I flinched slightly, an automatic reaction. Ghost lifted his head, not in alarm, but in recognition. He nudged my hand gently with his nose, a soft, warm pressure. He wasn't telling me the threat was near. He was telling me I was the one reacting. I rubbed his ears, feeling the muscles relax under my touch. "It's okay, buddy," I whispered. "Just a car." He put his head back down. He was telling me that he was fine. He was telling me that I was the one still on watch. I realized then that the trauma of a Project Nightwatch hadn't just affected Vance, or Ghost. It had successfully conditioned me, the handler, the man who uncovered the secret. I was the one who couldn't turn off the sensory input. But I accepted it. That was my retirement. My duty wasn't to fight a war in the desert anymore. It was to keep the peace right here, in this quiet ranch house. We had won the battle for the hallway, and we had liberated Ghost. But the watch continues, not with a machine, but with a promise. We are ready. We are vigilant. And in the long, still silence of the North Carolina night, the perfect sentry finally sleeps, knowing his handler is awake. And that, I realized, was the only peace I would ever truly need.